Good morning. Please take your seats. We're about to get started. Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Sebastian Burke. I'm the Director of Corporate Programs at the Council. Thank you again for coming this morning. It is my pleasure to welcome David Smick to our platform this morning. His new book, The Great Equalizer, How Main Street Capitalism Can Create an Economy for Everyone, will be available for sale and signing after the event. And David just told me that this week it's number 8 on the New York Times bestseller list, so congratulations. Hopefully it'll get to number 1. After his remarks, David will be joined on stage by Cecile Shea, our non-resident senior fellow for global security and diplomacy, for a discussion and Q&A. So according to the 2016 Council survey, 57% of Americans believe the next generation will be worse off economically than today's workers. That begs the question, what must we do to create an economy for everyone? This morning, I look forward to David's perspectives on this extremely important topic. For nearly a century, the Council has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active UN engagement in the world. We convene leading global voices, conduct independent research, and engage the public in the discourse on critical global issues. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. As you probably know, our spring season is in full swing, and we have several programs coming up. Tomorrow at lunch, we have a great panel on the future of trade, very important topic given the latest development under the Trump administration. And on January 26th, another fantastic panel on whether this is the Asian century. We have many other programs coming up, so please check our website. Before we begin, please know that this event is on the record. Feel free to use social media, and we are live streaming as well, but please silence your phones. Before we begin, please give me a second to briefly introduce our speaker and moderator. David Smick is Chairman and CEO of Johnson Smick International, a financial market advisory firm based in DC. He is also the founder, editor, and publisher of The International Economy. He wrote the 2008 best-selling book, The World is Curved: Hidden Dangers to the Global Economy, which was selected that year's best book on international business and globalization by Axiom Business Book Awards. Previously, David was a member of the U.S. Senate staff, chief of staff to a leader in the U.S. House of Representatives, and organized a series of U.S. congressional summits on the dollar and trade. His writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times, among others. Our moderator today is Cecile Shea, our non-resident senior fellow on global security and diplomacy. She is also president of Wakaru Communications, a special advisor to the Council's Next Generation programs. And she served as a U.S. diplomat for over two decades in various places. Previously, she was a foreign policy fellow in the office of former Senator Joe Lieberman and National Security Affairs fellow at the Hoover Institute. Her current research focuses on non-traditional security threats, including unemployment, economic displacement, and demographic change. And now, please join me in welcoming to the stage David Smick. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. In keeping with what we experienced this weekend, let me just say, as I look at each seat here, this is the biggest crowd that the Council has ever had in its entire history. I don't know, did we dream that, or what happened? Anyway, it's been quite a year. It's been, for some, ecstatic, some traumatic, but I've never seen a political year, an election year, in which the most popular joke that on the campaign scene was this: Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were in a rowboat, and the boat capsized. Who survived? The United States of America. I know. Anyway, I was not surprised that first Bernie Sanders did as well as he did, and then Donald Trump did as well as he did. Someone mentioned I wrote a book, The World is Curved, 8 years ago, and it began on a hunch a year before that, and the hunch was that the Wall Street banks had no idea what I call the trust me paper on their balance sheets. They had no clue what was on their balance sheets, and so I was at a Washington dinner party, and I was talking. The financial markets were booming. This was about a year before the crisis, and I said, I think there's going to be real problems ahead because of this, of the mortgage-backed securities and the derivatives associated with that. Everybody looked at me like I was crazy, but when I went home, on the way home, my wife said, well, if you really feel that way, you should write a book on the subject. And my day job is to advise hedge funds on the macro world, macroeconomic world. And so I did the foolish thing. I wrote this book and about that. And then I had, I would say a year ago, I guess, a second hunch. I promised my family I'd never write another book, but this hunch was that there was this inherent unhappiness and frustration throughout the country among average working families that, frankly, if you lived in a major metropolitan area, particularly if you lived in D.C. or New York, Chicago, I think in L.A., you had no clue. I saw statistics that said that half the country could not afford a $500 bill for an unexpected medical emergency or even a car repair. So essentially half the country was technically insolvent. And so they had nothing to lose. They looked at the situation around the country and they said, there are winners and losers and we're on the losing side. It just dawned on me that this was going to be a tumultuous year and we're going to see big changes. When you really get down to it, growth is everything. Well, maybe it's almost everything. I went back and I said, okay, how could we have the stock markets coming back? We have the economy not growing strongly, but it's not in recession. But we've been growing at 1.5% growth, and give or take. And I began to look at the history of economic growth. And if you look back since the date this country was founded, 1789, we grew at an average annual rate of 3.73%. And of course, now we're growing at half that. And we have a theory that economists have come up with called secular stagnation that says that's the best we can do because of technological and the demographic headwinds. And so I looked at that and I said, gee, well, can we believe the economists? And then I looked at, I said, Joe Stiglitz says economists are wrong. He won the Nobel Prize. They're wrong 60 to 70% of the time. So then I said, well, gee, that's the same accuracy rate as fortune tellers and tarot card readers. So apologies to the economists in the room, but many of whom do good work. But I began to look at this and say, in economics, it's behavior is a huge element in the equation. I mean, Keynes talked about animal spirits, and do we have to accept the growth that comes in at half the normal historic rate? So I went back and I said, what if the economy grew throughout American history at today's current growth rates, today's mediocre growth rates? If it had, we would today not have the per capita income of the world's strongest economy. We'd have the per capita income lower than Papua New Guinea, a tiny island, developing island in the middle of the South Pacific. So growth is everything. And it's, I also looked at, wage income. Average American families have not had a significant increase in wages and income. Really, it's not just during the Obama years, it's during the George W. Bush years. I mean, going back to 1998. So you've had a bipartisan period of economic mediocrity. Now, that led me to this observation, that you can tell people who are at, not the bottom, but people who are working families who are struggling to survive. You could say, but look, GDP is growing, and you can say, look, the stock market's up. Most of them don't, outside of a pension fund, they could care less if the stock market rebounded since 2008. What they care about is something called social mobility. And social mobility is the ability to move up the ladder of economic opportunity and success. So 30 years ago, if you were born into the bottom 25% of income-earning families, you had with hard work, imagination, creativity, and some luck, you had a 25% chance of rising to the top 25%. And frankly, that was my story. Today, you have a 5% chance. And so why? Well, why isn't there this dynamism that allows people to move up? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but I found the most intriguing one was, and the one that's never mentioned, it wasn't mentioned by Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump in the presidential race, but is the decline in business startups. I mean, business startups are happening at half the rate today that they were 15 years ago. People are holding back. And, the economy is, politicians too often understand the economy as kind of like a machine. It spits out loaves of bread, and predictable, or widgets and predictable measurements, and then you can use fiscal and monetary policy to determine the speed with which you roll out these predictable widgets or loaves of bread. That's not really how an economy works. Economy is more like a living organism with cells that many die, many grow, many appear, but it's a constant flux of success and failure. And economies move forward when you have more firms rising up than firms that are dying. And I began to look and say, gee, America's, our secret recipe, our secret ingredient was always that we had this kind of creative, daring population of risk takers. I mean, there's no other country in the world in which, but America, where people strike out on their own. They quit their jobs, they mortgage their houses, based on some idea. They go out and they borrow from family and friends in order to start up this firm, knowing that there's probably a 90% chance they're going to fail, but they do it anyway. They're kind of crazy, but kind of often crazy like a fox. I always found it interesting to look at startups in the U.S. from 1976 up until the financial crisis versus, say, startups in Europe. In the United States, we had dozens of startups that went on to become big companies, thriving companies, whether it was Apple or Intel or even Facebook and some of the newer companies. But I mean, you look at the list, and I mentioned them in my book, dozens of companies. And look at Europe during this period since 1976. How many startups in Europe went on to become big companies? One. The energy company in Norway. So that was always our secret weapon, and yet that's slipping away now. So my book really concentrates on why startups are down, why productivity, which is, as a result the productivity rates are half of what they were. And I concluded that there are a number of reasons, which I cover in the book, of why people are holding back. But one is I think the most overriding is that our political system has been taken over by what I call a corporate capitalism. And that's the capitalism of backroom deals and inside privilege. And it's where companies manipulate the regulatory and the patent and the antitrust laws in order to gain advantage over competitors. And what I found really interesting is that you would think it wouldn't be true, but even the centers of American innovation, the real hotspots, Facebook and Google, spend more money today on lawyers and lobbyists, and I guess buyout experts, to stifle competition than they do on new research and development. And so we say, well, gee, I wonder why our economy is now growing at half the rate that it has in the past. Now, I know that a lot of people come up to me after these speeches and say, well, how much, tell me again what you're talking about, corporate capitalism. I said, yes, I'm talking about the capitalism of the inside, the stifling capitalism of the inside deal making, in which you can even see it since the financial crisis. I mean, we had the Fed. What did it do? It came up with a policy. Look, thank God the Fed intervened. And, there's some conservatives said, well, we should have let prices clear. We could have cleared prices all the way to a depression. But once you've injected liquidity into the banking system and you put depression off the table, I mean, we've had a monetary policy that has basically been heavily in favor of the big and the large and of status quo and the corporate to the disadvantage of Main Street, of the small business sector, and particularly the entrepreneurial and the startup side. And they said, but we have to do it this way because the big firms present systemic risk. And all that, fine, but the unintended consequences of that have been horrible. And you can see it. Talk to any small businessman. They said because of the excessive rules on the regulatory front, on Dodd-Frank and others. I mean, if you want to start a business, what does a bank tell you? Or if you have a struggling business, said, come back, 3 years of collateral. And come back and give us a dozen years of your business experience. And you say, well, what are you talking about? What did Mark Zuckerberg have as business experience? I mean, we've stepped on the oxygen hose, the financial hose of the most dynamic, potentially, sector of the economy. And I argue that we need to return to something called more Main Street capitalism, the capitalism of startups, of a level playing field. I know it sounds like a pipe dream, but it's Main Street capitalism is what I call a mindset. It's a mindset in Washington that says, look, if we do this, are we going to hurt the one group that doesn't have a lobbyist? And that's the group that represents companies and startups that that haven't come into existence yet. So, but it's confusing. So I know these terms, so I hate when people read from their book, but let me just read you one section which seems to people kind of get. The terms Main Street capitalism and corporate capitalism, I know can be confusing, so I would say consider this parable. It involves two cows. Now, under communism, you have two cows. The state takes both and gives you some milk. Now, under fascism, you have two cows. Government shoots both of them. Then they mistakenly throw away the milk. Under socialism, you have two cows. You give one to your neighbor. Under Main Street capitalism, that's the form of capitalism espoused by my book. You have two cows. You sell one and buy a bull. Your herd multiplies. The economy grows. You sell them and retire on the income. Now, under corporate capitalism, that's a smothering form of capitalism that I think has taken hold in the U.S. economy the last decade and a half. You have two cows, and you engage in financial engineering. You sell three of them to your publicly listed company using letters of credit opened by your brother-in-law at the bank. Then you execute a debt equity swap with an Associated General offer so that you get all four cows back with a tax exemption for 5 cows. The milk rights of the 6 cows are then transferred via an intermediary to a Panamanian company, secretly owned by the majority shareholder, who sells the rights to all 7 cows back to your listed company. Like magic, your annual report says your company now owns 8 cows with an option to buy more. And then, in your final act as a corporate capitalist, you hire an army of lobbyists, you pass laws and promulgate regulations that make the purchasing of milk from all other cows but yours either highly expensive or illegal. And this book is, and I know most of you want to talk this morning about what's happening in Washington and what's happening around the world, and I'm quite willing to get into that. But this book is really a book that I wrote for millennials, because if we continue along this path of mediocre growth, they're not going to have a future. I mean, it's pretty amazing to me that we went through a presidential campaign in which both candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, never mentioned the word debt and never mentioned the words unfunded entitlements or underfunded entitlements. Secular stagnation is a big deal. If we accept that, our kids are not going to have a future. You look at the world today. In the next quarter century, we're going to have 3 billion new citizens of the world, having entered the middle class with huge expectations, and a quarter of them are going to be 30 and under, looking for jobs, looking for a new way of life. And we cannot hand a world over to our kids where essentially there's populist anger, not just in pockets but everywhere. That's why this a growth agenda is so important. Now, I get into a lot of in the book what I consider solutions. And I don't do them as an ideological pipe dream from either the right or left. I've tried to sit back as someone who's been in Washington for, I'm not proud of this, but going on 40 years, and I look and say, what could conceivably get through Congress? What could both parties, and there are quite a few things both parties agree on if they had a big enough leader who could say, we can get this. I mean, you say why startups are way down. Well, 80% of, it's well known, of net new jobs come from firms 5 years old or less. What's less well known is the vast majority of new job opportunities and dynamism comes after a firm goes public. And it's very difficult now for firms to go public. I mean, we're seeing, it used to be you had big firms that went public, capitalized under $1 billion. Now, there's so much capital, a lot of it coming in from offshore. There's so much capital now that there's a kind of private funding. And we're seeing the whole democratic notion of risk capital coming through the public offering system. That's fading quickly, and that's a problem. But companies, it's very easy to say, why aren't you going public? You talk to these people. Well, it's $2 to $3 million in the post-Sarbanes-Oxley world, of a post-Enron world with Sarbanes. It's very, very expensive, and also it's a culture now that it's cutting against them on this. So and that would be easy to fix. I mean, the Kaufman Institute has come up with a whole series of proposals. One is you can allow with just a simple vote of a board to say, look, investor beware, this company is going public, but it's not filing the $3 million of paperwork because it doesn't have the money, but it has a brilliant idea. But just be aware of that, and particularly if you're an institutional investor. But we can at least get these firms moving. Let me end this. We're of course entering an age. I watch Donald Trump is he's having this whole circus going on where he's he's cajoling the corporate sector in this country to do this and to do that. And some of it is actually kind of worthwhile. I kind of like the notion of saying, of the President of the United States being able to say, $4 billion for an airplane, for Air Force One, come on. And immediately, oh, yeah, that is too expensive. And the F-35, are we really going to spend that? I mean, shouldn't we bid this out? And of course, there's panic. So you know that there's a whole military industrial complex, and there's also a medical industrial complex that has to be dealt with, and that's all fine. But and I think being able to, Reagan did this in 1981. He fired the air traffic controllers, and it created kind of a paradigm shift. Up until that point, American corporations were laughed at as dinosaurs. The Ford Pinto was kind of the poster child, this safety challenge car. And I think when Reagan fired the air traffic controllers, this is the Alan Greenspan theory, it created a paradigm shift, and it sent the message that because after that firing there wasn't a across-the-board labor shutdown of the transportation system, which would have created a huge recession. There was a sense that there was a green light to restructure the American corporate sector. And I think when Trump does his various stunts on the corporate side about kind of thinking that the American worker doesn't matter in the equation, I think that's probably good. It creates a paradigm shift, a sense of, okay, we're going to leave no one behind. There's not going to be the forgotten men. What bothers me and what troubles me is that, it's so top down. I mean, you cannot have a policy that's on today's economy, particularly in today's information economy, that's strictly top down. And if you develop, if you're build skyscrapers for a living and you develop these things, you are a top down guy. You come up with a design and you say, okay, implement the design. But we live in a bottom up world. The information economy is decidedly bottom up. It's an economy you can't predict. You can't control. You can try to set up nurturing conditions for this, but it's it is something that I'm concerned because I think I don't hear any of this kind of talk of startups coming from either party, but particularly here we have a new administration. It's all top-down corporate, but not a lot of startups, very little talk about the entrepreneurial sector. Even the discussion with Silicon Valley is more of, what can existing firms do? Part of my argument here is that when you look at the economy of the future, ideas, information will be, that'll be the most valuable form of capital. And, with artificial intelligence, we have huge amounts of pessimism. People are worried not just for themselves, but for their kids. Well, artificial intelligence is going to increase, estimates our IQ will increase, 1.5 points a year. So within the next decade, artificial intelligence will be smarter than 90% of the U.S. population. There are huge policy issues here about the ability of AI, artificial intelligence, to put half the country out of work. And but I would argue that history has always been a history of pessimism. That when you look at every technological advancement that came along, it was met with pessimism. And the common theme is that the pessimists have always been wrong. I mean, the saddle maker said the internal combustion engine is going to destroy the world. It didn't happen. Then when 85% of the country lived on farms, they saw the advancements in farm technology and they said, we're going to have all these people sitting around with nothing to do. Didn't happen. new industries sprung up. So I tend to be an optimist I agree with Warren Buffett, America's best days lie ahead. Information is valuable, but unlike the economies of the past of physical goods, an information economy, the economy of the future will give everyone access to the means of production. Everyone with a computer. And you look at the world and you say, boy, it's scary, and there's so many things going on, and we can talk about this. But the one positive thing that I look at, I say, well, unlike in the past, where there were ugly things happening in the world, today's world is different. I mean, you will have within a decade 3 billion people around the world holding in their hand some version of the smartphone, which will have more computing power than NASA had in the 1960s. So my argument is that's a lot of brains and that's a lot of computing power figuring out how to create a credible economy for the future. And so that's why I'm optimistic, and that's why I would urge you to buy many books so that the millennials in your life, those of you who aren't millennials, can get a sense of what the future holds and how there is something positive for them. So I want to go ahead and we'll answer some questions. And we don't have to talk about the book. I've already done that. We can talk about the world if you like.
We're going to talk about the book and the world. Is my mic on? Yes.
Excuse me.
Oh, yeah. Well, this is a great book. I think this is the first book I've read that's published in 2017. So that was kind of fun in the first place. And I read it over the weekend. Thank you. And the explanation that you have in the foreword of how economic policies of the last 10 years have benefited a small number of people to the detriment of particularly small towns and rural areas, I thought was the most succinct and understandable explanation that I've read. So that alone is worth reading. But I wanted, at the end you have, if I can find it, I marked all my pages so diligently over the weekend, and then I left my copy of the book in my apartment. So, where are your 14? Do you remember where your 14?
Yeah,
oh, I found them. I found them. So
it's very Wilsonian.
So what I was going to do was kind of summarize the 14 recommendations that you have made to move forward. I have 3 quick questions of my own, and then we'll open it up to all of you for any questions that you have for Dave. And as I read this, think about the fact that there are things in here that progressives will love, there are things in here that progressives will hate, there are things that conservatives will love, and there are things that conservatives will hate. And that kind of gives away what my first question is. Recommendation number 1, grand bargains with Congress. Establish a new paradigm with bold policy compromises dependent on bipartisanship in Congress. Bring our capital home in exchange for enticing U.S. corporations via a tax holiday to repatriate capital. Insist those firms purchase specific amounts of special infrastructure bonds paying 1%. I thought that was a really interesting. Avert debt crises. And you have a variety of recommendations, not just for the U.S., but worldwide, because your point is there are a lot of countries that are far worse off than we are, including China, which people don't talk about very often and which is alarming from a security standpoint. Tax reform, Reagan 2.0. Invest in youth, so important. And your idea is to give each one a stock portfolio, basically at birth, that they then keep, and they're supposed to pay off the original principal, I suppose, at death or at a certain age, yes. Recreate a global financial architecture, a global kind of Plaza 2. Those of you who remember the Plaza Accords on financial architecture, we need a Plaza 2, is Dave's point. Encourage new enterprises by encouraging the Federal Reserve to rethink the way that it handles the money supply, I think is basically your recommendation. Improve the management of non-financial assets. In other words, try to make money off of some of the real estate that the U.S. owns. Modestly raise the minimum wage. increase worker mobility. So if you're laid off in Galesburg, Illinois, and there are jobs in Chicago, maybe the government can help you somehow afford to relocate to Chicago, because workers currently owning homes there are not going to be able to relocate unless someone helps them, right? Immigration reform, welcome foreign geniuses, is your point. Pause that refreshes. Get rid of the 50 worst regulations and punish the people who...
Well, where corporations
Yes.
have manipulated the system to say, if we can lobby for this regulation, that'll destroy our competitor.
Yeah.
And I'd say just, want to have an executive order, boom.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit like the Chinese saying to scare the monkey, sometimes it's to scare the dog, kill the chicken. If Washington would just identify and say, this is a no-go, we don't tolerate this type of regulatory manipulation, I think it would have a transformative effect.
Fund adult tech education, reform community colleges, force them to go back to their original missions of adult education, evening school, weekend school.
Right.
You have some interesting comments about the number of F-visa students, foreign students attending community colleges right now because they pay a lot of tuition, and that was really never the mission.
Community colleges have become a finishing school for particularly the Chinese, where if they pay the full freight, they come in, they learn better English, they become acclimated to the U.S. Living here, and then they apply to MIT. And that's not why we set up
our community colleges.
Yeah.
And then reinvent the government, including new Civil Service Reform Act. So in the current partisan tribal atmosphere in Washington, about which you write a great deal in this book because you've worked for both parties, right? You've worked for administrations from both parties, and you have great things to say about Ronald Reagan and about Bill Clinton in this book. Is there any way we can accomplish any of these things given the current atmosphere in Washington?
Well, let me go back and say why I propose. I didn't pick up or build a list that was the list from the right or the left. And I began to think, I chose these things because it goes back to the whole startup culture. And I made a list of why people are holding back, why our risk takers are holding back. And by startup culture, by the way, I didn't get into this, but I'm not talking just about Silicon Valley. I mean, if you look at the history of rises in per capita income, you would think that, going back centuries, that the Enlightenment would have seen a wonderful life for the little guy, given the rebirth of knowledge. Never happened. Per capita income took off around 1820 in 4 countries: U.S., Britain, France, and what we now know as Germany. And it was, and it lasted till the First World War. Some would say up until the '60s, but it was per capita income exploded upward because of a mentality, and it was kind of this. The Main Street capitalism meant that people became idea machines, individuals, as they broke away from the state and from the church. They began to apply what Nobel Prize winner Ned Phelps calls, they engaged in a great flourishing, where ordinary people took, the current technological advancements and provided commercialization of those things, but it was kind of everyone was on the make to create something, and Lincoln, in the middle of the Civil War during this period, noticed this. He said Americans have this intense curiosity for the new that he said it's just increasing, and that's in the middle of a Civil War. So that was a mentality, and one reason I call this Main Street capitalism is that I'm not looking to say, gee, we need more Silicon Valley innovation. We need innovation. We need that mentality throughout the economy, not just in these particular centers. But I began to look and say, what is holding back the risk takers from the average person? And there are a lot of different things, and I address them through this list that we've put together. They are worried about debt. If you look around the world today, The world's, this is just one example, but public and private debt, the world's 300% debt the public and private debt is 300% of the world's GDP. I mean, and even worse, we have $20 trillion in dollar-denominated debt sitting around the world, half of it in emerging markets, with China being the biggest holder. So you say, why does that matter? Well, we have a president who's kind of repeating somewhat the Reagan policies, tax cuts, massive deregulation, spending. In the case of Reagan, military spending. You're probably going to get infrastructure spending from Trump. But what did you see? You saw a soaring dollar. Dollar soared until in the mid-'80s, the U.S. had to instigate the Plaza Accord, as you mentioned, which was to stabilize the dollar, and then beyond that, the Louvre Accord to try to bring the dollar down because, at that point it was against the Japanese yen. We were being priced out of markets, and so, but you have this, soaring dollar. So what's the soaring dollar do if we have the same experience? And the dollar's gone up, dramatically since Donald Trump was elected. If we move to a border adjustment tax, which is what the Ways and Means is considering, and it's kind of in the financial news right now, the one effect of that is going to be a huge rise in the dollar. Because if your tax is at the border, it's on destination, and it's a 20% tax on things coming in, but no tax on things going out, that's going to be massive amount of capital inflows in the U.S. The dollar will go up. But what happens? It's like a global Rubik's Cube. So when you do that, what happens to emerging market debt? Well, emerging market debt that's denominated in dollars, that's 20 trillion, almost the size of U.S. GDP. That debt grows for all these countries. So you're going to see defaults, or in the case of China, they disguise their defaults. You just get a letter that says we're not going to pay for a while. But you're going to, and you're going to have countries where, with the dollar rising, the cost of commodities, because commodities are denominated in dollars, rise. So you have economies all over the world who are going to see their cost of energy go up. So their ability to service their debt will go down. When I look at China, just people say, oh, but the Chinese are going to do what? China is a mess. Their debt now is exploding. They're about to become another Japan. Yeah. And so you look around the world there, and I say, well, the next president, we didn't hear any of this in the campaign. We should be preparing a major global debt conference and know what we're going to do in the event that we get a global debt meltdown with massive defaults.
But I guess back to my initial question, thinking of the members of Congress and the amount of time that they spend every day dialing for dollars and the amount that they are dependent on a broken campaign finance system.
Yeah.
Understanding the kind of, there are not a lot of people among those 535 who are going to be able to understand a lot of the economics that are explained in this book. And that, frankly, is a concern to me, because how then are we going to move forward with these very necessary decisions if you have folks who are only focused on being reelected 2 years from now?
Well, that's true. The average person in Congress is not going to know any of this. But the Treasury Secretary and the White House, chief economic advisor, they should be involved. And the congressional leadership. Paul Ryan read the book. Larry Summers read the book. Austin Goolsbee from town read the book. And I gave one to Newt Gingrich.
So do you think we can move
And they all
past
kind
this?
of said, God, it's so much common sense.
It's so much common sense.
I said, well, good, endorse it. And they all did. But, whether you can get, I think what you're saying is whether we can do contingency planning or whether we just wait till it all comes crashing down on us. That's probably the way Washington usually works.
Yeah.
Is we wait till it crashes down.
Until they all walk out ashen-faced from that famous meeting in 2008, right?
The problem we face is that in every major, what they call hard land or crisis of the past, it's taken about 300 basis points of Fed ease. That is, the Fed drops interest rates, not in one move, but over a series of moves, 3 percentage points. to prevent a hard landing. That's been the shock absorber.
Oh.
Well, we can't, the Fed's barely over one, we're not, the Fed's not in a position.
We're on wooden wheels now.
We
There
have
are
no
no
ammo.
shock- yeah,
We
there
have
are
no
shock
ammo, and
absorbers,
and the central banks around the world have no ammo, other than to buy bonds, which they can, and continue negative real interest rates.
So let me ask a real quick question, if you give a quick answer, and then we're going to
Yep.
go out here. In those 14 points, and I skipped over it, you talk about antitrust enforcement. And we have a recent example in an industry that's actually important to the Midwest, the RV industry, which had massive consolidation after 2008. Very few companies now produce most of the product. And what is happening is they are making deals with the component suppliers so that those component suppliers cannot sell to other companies.
Right.
So if you want to start up a small boutique RV company making, travel trailers or whatever, you can't get refrigerators.
Yeah, no,
So I mean, and this
Bernie-
is one of the problems.
Yeah.
So I mean, pity the poor go-getter who wants to go build something, right?
Look, Bernie Sanders was right. The system is rigged. Now, his solution is to move to a European-style social democratic system. And I would argue, sounds great, but let's take a look at the track record there. The track record there is a disaster. We have a track record that, you look back, I mean, even recent history, I don't know why, but in economic discussions, the Clinton years, first the Reagan years are presented as a disaster. The Clinton years are presented as horrible. Because okay, they made mistakes. The whole notion of eliminating the separation of in banking between securities
The
firms.
overturn of Glass-Steagall. Yeah.
They didn't think through, do we have a regulatory system that's capable of handling this? Well, we obviously didn't, And so they made their mistakes, but I mean, when the idea that the Clinton years were horrible years was just nonsense.
But you would support his thought that bigness has gone too far.
Bigness is killing us, and it is. I mean, in America today, in the American economy, and this is the problem when you say, why are we, there's so many reasons why we're growing so slow, but I would summarize it in one line. In Washington, Goliath always wins. The little guy, and that's why I wrote this book. The great equalizer is startup capitalism.
Yeah. And not just high tech, but also the woman who wants to start a small nursing home or something.
For years, I've been saying, and I wrote this in my first book. If you are, and a lot of friends got angry with me because I'm in, I work for a lot of financial institutions, but I said in my first book, and I said it again here, if you are, say you start up, you're in Chicago here, and you start up 5 dry cleaning operations.
Yeah.
And you employ 100 people, and it's a thriving success. You are that guy, some people here won't remember this, but you're the guy who lived next to Archie Bunker.
Yeah.
Jefferson, was it?
Yeah.
And you
Moving on up.
You're moving on up.
That's
You've got
right.
these 5 dry cleaning operations, okay. You're going to pay your taxes every year. You pay a rate, and you have been paying a rate, twice the rate of a guy on Wall Street dealing with a private equity firm who is a multi-billionaire, but he's only paying a capital gains rate.
He's paying a rate on paper.
He's paying a rate on paper.
Yeah.
You're employing all these people, and you're taking a lot of risk. There's somebody else. And it's just one example, though, of a system in which, we wonder why people are discouraged.
And if you want to know what Dave says about Piketty, you'll have to read the book. But he has some interesting points. But we're going to open it up to questions, or you can ask a question. So if you could wait for the microphone to get to you, if you do have a question, and if you could, because we only have, I ran a little late, my apologies, if you could be as cogent and concise with your question, that would be really appreciated. So, yes, right here.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation as well. What I sense is kind of an emotional malaise in many parts of the United States. We read about the anger that exists, and in the Rust Belt, especially states like Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, where there's ravaged economies in the small towns. Some of the one industry towns have those industries having left. There's opioid addiction, there's education problems. There really seems to be an emotional malaise, which J.D. Vance talks about in his book, Hillbillyology. Your 14 points are dynamic, but in the short term, what do we do for those communities, the ones that surprised everyone in the election, who really have serious problems that our media talks much about inner city problems, but what's going on in the rural communities seems to be, in a longer term, a more compelling problem for America and its economy. So what's your thoughts about that?
Excellent question.
Yeah, I do get in the book quite a bit. It's into the whole question of declining educational system and the social. I mean, you really, it's kind of controversial to talk about, but I think it's to turn the U.S. around, to turn the U.S. economy around the way I'm talking about. You cannot avoid talking about values, and values are a big part of this. Nobody wants to talk about it, but you cannot have a situation where you have a class, for example, at Harvard, in which 60%, I believe it's 60% of the class is caught cheating. And the subject of the class, ethics. You know, I mean, you have this kind of a system that we need to come to terms with. I call for, I mean, look, we're going to have to completely revamp our educational system but particularly in terms of what we tell our kids. We are now telling the kids in those Rust Belt areas, like, look, you are, what you need to do is be a computer programmer. You know, so father who's an unemployed steelworker says, be a computer programmer, and be the math major. And I kind of wonder if, in fact, we haven't thought through the future of these people in terms of how the new economy is going to affect them. I mean, we're telling them to refurbish and really hone their analytical side. But the reality is that their analytical side is probably going to be vulnerable to being replaced by a computer. That person who is the best, computer programmer, is probably going to find within 10 years he or she's going to be replaced. Right. So what is it that we should be telling our kids? I think you have to have a creative element. I mean, you have to constantly these kids ought to be re-educated. Constantly, we should have, I call for vouchers and certain grants for underprivileged people they're going to have a series of lifetime education, whether through night school or through community college or through online education, with an eye toward the creative. Because it's not just, I have to keep up my analytical skills. We probably won't be able to beat a computer. We will, it'll be a creative element. It's the one thing that the machine can't do. I make this joke, but I do predict that in 20 years, we're going to wake up and see a headline that says, the chairman of General Motors, the new chairman, she's a fine arts major. Yeah. Why? Because today, what are cars? They're 20% software. Within 10 years, they're going to be 80% software. The thing that will distinguish the car will be the aesthetic. But we're not telling kids that today about how to perform in the new economy. And the reason I think I'm right, look at Steve Jobs years ago when he did the iPad. Aesthetics were very important to him. The classical design. So people say to me all the time, oh, what should my kid's majoring in math or computer? I said, great, but make sure he should minor in art history or something. Have a creative element, because that person who can kind of who has that is going to thrive. Now, on the immediate side, I have no, I think we're living in a time where the public and the message of this campaign, where the result was total surprise, the vast majority of the country, was that people are saying, we don't care how you get there. We're not ideological. We are not a part of any party. We want pragmatic solutions. We want you to get there. Just figure out how to get us higher growth, and don't give us excuses or tell us about, well, that would not be ideologically pure. So I have no, I mean, I would think for Trump it would be a mistake to come in with tariffs on these things, but those Republicans who say, oh, we can't have a border adjustment tax, in which which would essentially just give us a tax system, not that it's a perfect system, because there are all kinds of unintended consequences, but all we'd be doing would be putting in a tax system that's similar to what everyone else has in the world, which is why the border adjustment tax system probably will be WTO compliant. I mean, the World Trade Organization will have to agree to it. A tariff wouldn't be. So it's funny, I was privy this weekend, the Republican leadership in Congress and Donald Trump have this disagreement on that, because Trump, he definitely wants the tariffs, because the tariffs have headline appeal. They're like macho. Look, we're going to stick it to and that's good politics in the Rust Belt, But I think we'll have retaliation and then, whatever. Whereas the less sexy but more potent border adjustment tax, we can explain as not declaring a war on the rest of the world. We're just not being the saps. We're going to essentially have a tax system like everybody else. And I think that's, that's going to be a much better way to go about that. So that, but I do agree with you that we have to get in a very pragmatic way, get in and help those people. But particularly, I find most people that I talk to who are and I come from a blue collar background in Baltimore, as I explained in this thing, or as we call it in Baltimore. People are less concerned for themselves. They're terrified for their kids. And that's the thing that really Washington ought to be saying, what are we going to do to protect your kids? Because this world is pretty threatening, and that's what they're looking for.
And I grew up in a small town that, much to my shock, voted for Trump in this election. And I keep thinking of the words of Brandeis 100 years ago when he used to speak of bigness, which he would speak of bigness in terms of harming people's soul. And I see that in my town, especially bigness in the retail sector, which means you can't own your own dress shop anymore, right? Because you can't compete with Walmart that's 20 miles away. And also the huge inflow of private equity in the last 10 years, so that the major employers are no longer locally owned. They're owned by somebody in New York who's going to sell it in a year to somebody else in New York. And that's very hard on the local community. And so I think that your book indirectly discusses two issues that really have impacted at least my small town, and I suspect many other small towns.
When you look at what happened since the financial crisis in 2008, what was the crisis? Right after the crisis, the rest of the world said, this is an indictment of the United States. It's an indictment of Wall Street. This is an indictment of kind of the Anglo-Saxon view of markets, of liberalized financial markets. So you would assume the rest of the world would have moved off. Capital flows into the United States since the financial crisis have grown at a rate, or are coming at a rate, twice the rate as before the crisis. And the only way to do it is consider this is that, in the global beauty pageant, we're the least ugly contestant.
I mean, they're flowing in despite the fact that we have basically zero interest rates, right?
And at first I saw this data, I thought, oh, this is just Russian oligarchs and rich Chinese families. But no, it's German companies buying up Midwestern firms. There's nothing wrong with capital flowing in and all the rest, but it definitely changes the nature of our economy, because the cost, financial risk becomes
Yes.
greatly undervalued, but also you do get, you're seeing it right now, private equity. These private pools of capital are really not helpful for small town America, for the little guy.
That's right. I'm sorry, this has been so fascinating. I want to give everyone a chance to purchase a book if you're interested and then have it signed. We think it's available on Kindle.
It's available on
It's
all
available on Kindle.
Kindle
And it will be available over here in the corner and
Barnes & Noble, everything
Barnes
else.
& Noble, and maybe Dave will have a second to chat with some of you also if you're
And
interested.
by the way, I just got the call. It's this weekend. It will be number 8 on the which is hard to do
It's very
for an
accessible.
economics book.
It's very entertaining. He intersperses a lot of personal stories from his own life in Washington, so it's very entertaining and accessible. So with that, thank you to all of you for being here so early in the morning, and thank you, Dave, for visiting the
Thanks for
council this
coming.
morning. Thank you so much.